Hey there, sinners. It's Adam Knox, and welcome to another episode of The Cult of You, and specifically an interview with the devil. Today's interview is one that I've been looking forward to for some time because it's a conversation that I just had to have. And it is with one of the most influential figures on the thought processes in demonolatry and demonology as it is today in the occult world. She's the author of countless additions to our community. The amount of books that she's written is too numerous to mention. One that she's the most famous for, and most people know her for, is the complete book of demonolatry. Now, Connolly sits down today with me as we explore some of those interesting questions, and we get the truth about demonology from probably one of the most well-known and respected authors in the field today. I want you to enjoy today's discussion, but I want you to really have a perspective look upon her journey, because I dive a little bit into where she came from, what was her first experiences, and we explore the nature of demons. We also discuss the enns, how these were discovered, where these came from. We explore a little bit more as well, what do we utilize, sigils, enns, or whichever. What is the actual inner game or psychology behind this, as well as a very important subject in terms of not only the mental health requirement, in terms of the magical and mystical, but also how old unhealthy doctrines and paradigms, such as the old Western Christian view of demonology, actually can be the biggest hindrance to your practice as a symbol of pretty much a scotoma at play inside of yourself and the pathway of healing and releasing that. Sit back, relax, and enjoy today's episode, and remember to live deliciously. Stephanie, it is an absolute honor and pleasure to have you on the Cult of You. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
No, it's an absolute gift. I've been an astute fan, follower of your work since the beginning of my journey in many ways. And you've opened so many doors for me in just understanding this aspect. And I think for a lot of people, coming across this work, especially ones that come from maybe a more traditional ceremonial magical point of view, or that have been very much caught in the typical Western indoctrination,
Right.
And see the demonic very much from that Christian frame journey. Your work has done a lot to open up. I mean, from the Goethic works to step away from that long Solomonic work to opening things as well. I have so many questions I want to dive into, but I would like to begin maybe at the beginning for those that don't actually know you. I mean, I don't think a person just wakes up one morning and you're like, I am an author of multiple, endless journeys of books and amazing pieces of work. What was the spark? What was the journey? How did that start, for you personally? Was it an intellectual one, a spiritual one? Could you open up a bit on that?
It's kind of interesting because when I was young, I used to have these experiences with spirits. I would wake up and see a shadow figure standing over my bed, or sitting at the end of my bed. There were instances where I would kind of see these faint outlines, these figures, and I thought, okay, well, either I'm crazy or there's something else going on, because nobody else could seem to see what I was seeing. And my mother always, discounted it as an imagination. a very active imagination, which is probably true. I do have, an active imagination, but it continued on until I was probably a preteen. And at that point, I was finally able to go to bigger libraries and look stuff up. And I was wondering, why is it I can see these things that other people cannot? So I began doing research.
You were always open to that. You didn't repress it. You allowed that relationship to grow.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I started checking out books on, spirit communication and people who are mediums. And of course, you can't really get into that topic without getting to, say, divination and witchcraft and eventually demonology. So I was probably about 12 years old when I started delving into all of these topics.
Yes.
And about 13 when I decided, there's something here. And it was probably between 13 and 14 that I decided I was a Satanist at that point. So after doing all of the reading, because that's mostly what I spent my childhood doing, was reading. So
okay. Wow. So question on that, it didn't sound like there was, but was there a strong Christian frame in your upbringing, or was it slightly more open to exploring?
It was a bit more open. My parents are what I term Jack Christian, where it's like, yeah, they believe, but they're really open-minded about it. So I did have a very evangelical aunt who insisted on dragging my sister and I to Vacation Bible School.
Oh, wow.
In the summers. And then my Catholic grandmother dragged me to the Catholic Church one time, and she sent me into the catechism class. And gosh, I couldn't have been more than 8 years old at the time.
Yeah,
maybe 7-ish. I don't know, somewhere in there, somewhere between 7 and 10. And the priest did the whole cross thing over my face, and I ran screaming from the room. So my grandmother never took me back to the Catholic Church. She was far too embarrassed. But
well, I mean, thank goodness for that. A young child, even as a young child, already aware of what was in the functional system.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
I'm curious, as you then kind of progressed in your study, was that ever a hindrance in terms of your education around the demonic? Did you have to deal and resolve some of those paradigms? How did that kind of work for you?
Well, I think a lot of people, when they initially approach Satanism or left-hand path or anything like that, they're coming from a Christian viewpoint. You're coming from that point of demons are these evil beasties, and the demonic is something bad, and it encompasses everything evil about the world.
Yes.
So admittedly, I did come to it from that perspective. And so I would almost say I was a Christian Satanist until I was 16 and introduced to a different point of view. So and then I did have to go through a process of kind of getting rid of that Christian, that societal influence, that Christian influence in my life. And it took a while, but I would say, and as strange as it sounds, Anton Xander LaVey's Satanic Bible was instrumental. Just reading that was instrumental in helping me just see how ridiculous Christianity was in general.
So out of curiosity, was it a single kind of aha moment that changed the relationship with the demonic, or was there an overarching paradigm that you had to almost kind of review certain narratives inside of yourself? And what was maybe, if you don't mind me asking, what was maybe one of the richest or more empowering parts of the new narrative that allowed you to open up to the demonic as an empowering idea?
Well, honestly, I think it started with some of my experiences when I was young, because a lot of these spirits that I saw, they were just dark figures. And there was one point where I was just testing fate because I had gone to the Vacation Bible School that my aunt dragged me to. And she was always talking about, she was always preaching and talking about God. And at one night, I was probably about 9. I was missing a few books or something like that. And I just on a whim decided, I'm going to pray to Satan instead of God, because God, you can pray to that guy and he just never
check his
answers.
email.
Yeah, never checked his email. And so it was a really bizarre experience. Another one, my mother said, "Oh, it's just your imagination." So I prayed to Satan. I was like, "Hey, can you help me find these books?" Which was basically the prayer, essentially. And I woke up the next morning and something compelled me to go to my dresser drawer. My dressers were always messy inside. I was a kid. And I opened the bottom drawer, and there were the 2 books sitting on top, along with a couple other things that had gone missing. So I asked my sister, because I shared a room with my sister, I said, "Did you clean my drawers?" And she looked at me like I was crazy. I asked my mother, and she's like, "I never clean your drawers. That's your job."
Yeah.
And so I don't know how, I still to this day don't know how everything ended up all neat and nice and tidy in the drawer.
So a lot more of a friendly, well-organized Satan than the typical biblical version, right?
Right. And so when I went into the study of all of these things and started going into the occult, I remembered that, first of all, these dark figures never harmed me. They just kind of stood over me and just kind of watched me. And Satan had been super helpful when I actually prayed to him.
Yeah.
And so that kind of like, I think that in and of itself made me think, maybe these guys aren't so bad. Maybe these other spirits aren't such a bad thing. And so the psychological thing was, I want to find out what the truth is.
Okay.
Because it seems to me that there's a narrative here that's skewed to one side or the other. And of course, my entire view of all of that has changed now. I mean, because we're talking like, I'm 49 years old now. So
yes.
It's changed quite a bit.
It's a journey. You talk about this as well in some of your other kind of interviews and conversations online. In one of your broadcasts, you mention if somebody does approach the demonic and they do have this fear indoctrination of it, it's very likely that they will manifest a negative experience. And it's not necessarily the demon that's doing it, it's their own creation of that. Do you feel that sometimes the drama that a lot of people manifest is very strongly more psychological in terms of their panic and their fears than actually what the demonic really is about?
Oh, absolutely. Because I do believe that a lot of demons basically mirror back at you what you expect. So if you're expecting a horrifying experience or you are afraid, then they might mirror that back at you to make you face that fear. That's a lot of what magic is about facing your fears in order to grow as a person.
That's an interesting view. I kind of think it reminds me of like the relationship with humans and animals. Like a dog, if I'm afraid of a dog, it's going to sense the fear and attack. Versus if I approach it with confidence and love, it picks up a different, and I almost activate a different part of it inside of it. So it's almost less about the animal, even the spirit in the sense, and it's more about who I am and what my inner game is, so to speak, with that. Am I correct in my interpretation?
Oh, absolutely. I do believe like attracts like. You draw to yourself what you put out.
So if I can kind of unpack that a little bit more with you, what is your inner game, so to speak? What is your inner paradigm, your core beliefs when you're really approaching not just the demonic, but the entire practice of occult magic as a whole? Some people, there's so many mixed views and frames around that and approaches for everybody. From it's almost like a genie wishing well to, a sacrifice of blood to it's a psychological system. What's your personal approach and model of it?
I would say that, so I view the demonic as divine intelligence, which was the original meaning of the word, basically. And so I view the demonic as natural forces in the universe. And I view magic as both a psychological tool and a tapping of those forces in order to cause direct change in my life. So I can steer the trajectory of my life. So I absolutely do believe that a lot of magic is psychological, especially, I'm a firm believer in doing actual ritual in the physical world and not just the astral, because I think you get something from that.
Agreed.
I think if you're willing to put in the effort, the easier it is to set your mind to something or to make yourself aware of something. And you can use that to basically manifest what you want in your life. And I think the demonic oftentimes brings us opportunities. They bring us like the support, like to help us find our inner strength, because, the demonic is within us as well. Since the demonic makes up the natural universe, we are part of that natural universe. And so therefore we are also demonic.
I love that.
So we are, and a lot of time people will spend their lives trying to look into the eyes of their gods, and I kind of look at it as I am looking from the eyes of God. And I'm not saying I am a god, but I am the master of my life. Even when other things, even when things come at you from left field and you have no control over them, like death, illness, something bad happens, you lose your job. It's how you react to that makes it either a really, really horrible situation or a manageable one that you can learn from and grow from.
I love that. I think especially it is so apt for what's been going on in the occult communities. And it's not just limited to the occult communities, but I think in spirituality and different groups in general and in the world today, so many people, and even in my opinion, they approach magic as a way to not take responsibility, to give the responsibility over to some imaginary force, so to speak, and, make a quick payment in blood and all their problems are solved, instead of what you're highlighting here, that it's actually the opposite way. It's about total responsibility and accountability inside your practice and your role inside of the results that you're currently getting in your life. And the demonic doesn't necessarily solve the problem for you, but leads you to the issues inside of yourself and in the world that needs. But they can open the door, but the bigger work is with you. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And
absolutely.
How does that manifest, so to speak? You described earlier the journey of the spirit, and I resonate with that very well, because I still remember when I started off in spiritualism years ago, I used to see these when my grandmother passed away. And I kept seeing during times of distress this dark figure. And I would freak out a little bit coming from an initial Christian background. Until a spiritual teacher said to me, you know what, that's your grandmother. And it was only when I gave up my paradigm of fear that I could put energy into the blackness of the form and actually start seeing the shape of the spirit. And suddenly my dynamic changed, so to speak. I think a lot of people get confused, though, when they hear these stories because of the Hollywood conditioning, of how the entity manifests. It almost seems like Mephistopheles is going to open the door and suddenly, have a contract in hand. What is the experience in contact, in communication with spirit like, really, and how does that develop?
Well, the interesting thing is, it started, I could foresee them. I couldn't always hear them. But I think I was just always open to it, because for some people it's a very natural thing. For other people, you kind of have to work to that. But it did get to a point where I was actually doing some scrying, and I saw this horrific image in the mirror. Because like right when you're scrying, as everything clears and you kind of move beyond that fade, if you get an image that startles you or scares you, you automatically pull back. That's your natural reaction to that. And I think that's the hardest part, is getting past those fearful images. There was a period probably from age 18 to 23 where I had all but shut down my spirit communication because I had a bad experience with a scrying mirror. And so, and it was fear. I saw this horrific image, and it was probably what I wanted to see.
Mm-hmm.
Something terrifying, because I think we were working with Hecate, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
And this image came to me, and it was absolutely horrific. It was a woman with just skin peeling off and these white eyes and this dead looking thing.
Sure.
And it scared me so bad, I tried to block off the ability to communicate with the spirits. And it kind of like came back with a vengeance. I started having these nightmares of dead people, dead animals, dead things, and they were continuous. And it really, it really made me face some fears. And I think you're right. Like if you go into the situation fearing the spirits that you're calling on to work with, you bring that fear on yourself. But they would not stay quiet. They wanted me to hear them. And finally, I had to go to someone more experienced than me and have them kind of teach me how to not be afraid again. So, and I did that through a series of exercises where I basically just faced that fear and just did it over and over and over again. And when I realized they couldn't hurt me as long as I didn't allow it, if I didn't hurt myself, so to speak, then we could have a productive dialogue. So
I think that's key. It's like the idea of the Buddha seeing Kali, and when the layman experiences Kali is, you know, destruction and chaos. But when he experienced Kali, it was Ma Kali, and it was for no other reason than the quality of his own consciousness, and that changing our internal relationship with the spirit or that force is essential. But what you're speaking about, I think, is very, very interesting, because it shows that almost like when the door is opened, you can't shut it. The only way, you know, to master it is to go through it. You've got an excessive pack of tools and instruments on how to do that. What is your advice for somebody that's new, that's starting off? What are some tools, some things that they may be able to use to change that relationship or deal with it when that fear comes up for them?
Well, I think one of the things to remember that's important is nothing is going to happen that you are not going to allow to happen. And that's easier said than done, because we can say that all we want, but whether or not we really believe that is another story. You have to feel safe and comfortable in the place that you're at, wherever it is. I mean, even in the physical space that you're in. So for some people, that may be, you know, creating a demonic circle around them and feeling like, okay, because even though demonic circles aren't created for safety, they're created more for balance. And for focus. Some people will just feel more comfortable in that setting and say, okay, the demonic's not going to let anything happen to me while I'm communicating with these other spirits, or whichever spirit. So, I suppose, again, that's going to depend on how your thought process works. If your thought process is like, oh no, not demons, then you probably don't want to surround yourself with a demonic circle if you're trying to communicate.
Yes.
And that might just amplify the fear.
So you the inner game of this is pretty much 90% of it in many cases. But what? Because there is a degree of difference. There's the purely psychological level, and then there's that stage that almost comes beyond it. So a practitioner, and I think someone listening now understands that the first step that they need to do is they really need to resolve that psychological relationship with these aspects. They need to deal with the narratives inside of themselves that contradict it, because 90% of the time, that's the root of the drama. They need to take accountability and be willing to listen to the feedback and the changes to go through it. When they are now kind of progressing on this path, building the relationship with these forces and these entities, what's your advice?
Learn discernment. Discernment is really important. There are different types of spirits out there. There is divine intelligence, aka the demonic, And there are different types of divine intelligence. I view planetary spirits as divine intelligence. I view angelic spirits as divine intelligences. They're just different types of spirits that vibrate at different levels. And like angelic spirits vibrate way up here, which is why a lot of people will experience maybe fear, and because it'll trigger their fight or flight response because of the vibration. Whereas, some of your more common demonic spirits, like perhaps demons of the Goetia, vibrate a little lower, so they're a little more accessible to people, which is why I think the popularity of Goetia is so strong.
Is this also possibly why they're more associated to material results, being closer to the material realm?
Absolutely. So because they vibrate at a closer frequency to earthbound things.
Okay.
But learning discernment is important because you have other types of spirits out there. You have the dead, the tethered spirits that may be here still on earth that haven't left and gone beyond the veil yet. You have other type spirits that are basically feeders. They feed off of life energy. And a lot of the times when people are talking about demons and devils and scary things on the other side, that's what they're talking about, are these feeder type spirits.
Interesting.
And that's been my experience anyway. And a lot of people, terminology I've noticed in the occult world is like everything. Like we all have different terminology for the same thing. So a lot of time we're actually agreeing and talking about the same things. We're just using the different terminology.
The overdeveloped air archetype inside of the magical community is quite noticeable, so to speak. But that brings me to an interesting question. Israel Regardie, back in the old kind of classic Hermetic text, used to say one of the differences between old classic spiritualism and his interpretation of ceremonial magic was that spiritualism would just open you up to any spiritual force, where the structure of high magic was one to systemically raise your consciousness to a place where you would almost be out of the reach of some of those parasites or those feeders or whatever that energy is. What is the approach? How would the demonolator approach that? What is the demonic way in not becoming susceptible to those things? I think besides, because there's the psychological, but what's your take on that?
My take on that is when you start working with the demonic, because we don't we don't banish. I mean, yeah, you can clean your space, clean the negativity out of your space, but we don't banish the demonic divine.
Yes.
And one of the reasons we don't do that is because then the demonic presence just kind of sticks around. And that tends to, especially when we have beginners build a demonic circle construct. We kind of beat it into their heads, because once you have that demonic energy in there, not only does it keep the magician balanced during the work, but it helps focus all of that energy inward into that magical ritual space. But it also naturally tends to keep everything else out. So it's not protective by design, it's just protective by default. So once you start working with demons and you work with them for some time, your space, even your entire house, can become what I say covered in demonic presence. It's completely full of demonic presence all the time, because you don't dismiss them. You're just like, well, thank you for coming, go as you wish or whatnot. And that energy just kind of sticks around. But you start to you build up to it. So you know that you stop knowing it's there until you move into a new space or something like that, because then it's no longer there. And that's when you realize that it was there.
Is it kind of like, if I want to use the frame, it's more like a bodybuilder going to gym, and the more you work out on a certain muscle, the more that energy develops. So instead of you necessarily putting a protection field on, you're almost covering yourself in that force and then maturing that force through the constant practice of it. Is that why utilizing a tool set like the enns so effective in bringing you into that vibration and then almost raising the consciousness to the essential quality of that essence? Is that kind of one of the things it does?
Yes. The enns, I'm not exactly sure who first coined them enns, why they're called that, but I suspect it comes from the alchemical term enns, which is to basically draw the essence from something. So when you are reciting an enn, you're basically drawing the essence of that demonic force into the ritual space.
Okay. So on top of that, there is quite a couple of discussions and debates around the communities of, do I use the sigils? Do I use the enns? What's your view?
I think that people should use what resonates with them, what draws them. I work with both sigils and enns.
Okay.
And one of the interesting things about enns is we do have a standardized set of enns for certain demonic forces. And you can find those in my books. You can find them on demonolatry.org. There's like lists of them. And you can use a prepared enn. But one of the things we also learn as demonolators is how to get enns, how to get sigils. Because remember, there's always that first person who had to write something down. I don't care if it was 500 years ago or last week. Someone is always the first one to write it down. And generally how we do this is by attuning ourselves to that demonic energy. If you don't have an enn, you can go get one. You just go into an ascended state and you communicate with the demonic force itself.
Okay.
And there are also a lot of variant enns around there. You'll find people will have their own set of enns that they've come up with, and they've done that by calling on the demonic force in their own language, whatever that language may be, having the sigil in front of them, or if they don't have a sigil, they can go get one too. Connecting with that demonic force by projecting from their own feelings and thoughts what that demonic force entails, and communicating, connecting, and drawing that enn or that sigil out of themselves.
So that's,
and the reasons they become standardized. Oh, I'm sorry. One of the reasons they become standardized is because a lot of people use them, and a lot of people have said, hey, this is effective. It goes from being unverified personal gnosis to verified personal gnosis, and it becomes a standard.
This is so interesting because, I mean, you, in your references of the enns, you talk about the different families that's been. Can you open up a little bit more about where some of these original ones come from that we know about? And also, one of the things that I want to kind of just add to that, when looking at those in the past references, you highlight that those could be the doors, they could be initial ones, but that also that it can be a very personal one, that almost an individual, depending on their state or their experience, could have a different interpretation. Does that mean that the brain's interpretation could be very individual?
Oh, absolutely. I believe most magic is subjective to a certain degree. And before we go on to like where the enns like originated from, I do want to say, like, a lot of people, they don't stop to really consider as above, so below. When you're looking at, say, all of the spirits have each of their own likes. They have their own correspondences. They have their own days. They have all of these things. The magical practitioner should have all of that too. And when you're working ritual, you have to combine that with the demonic force you're working with. It's a different alchemical mixture for each and every one of us who works with the demonic. Because when you add things to magic, it's like mixing things alchemically in order for a desired result. And that's why right. And that's also why sometimes some people feel a drawing to Belial, some don't, or some people view Belial as a feminine demonic divine, or a masculine, or give it some sort of like gender influence. This is why no two people's experience is going to be exactly alike, even if they're working the same ritual, working with the same correspondences, working with the same enns, and so on and so forth.
That makes perfect sense.
So, but if you wanted to talk about the families, where demonolatry actually comes from, I think is where it comes right down to. So what happened was, well, I don't know exactly how it happened, but I do know that at least from the mid to the late 20th century, these people who all worshipped different pagan, so to speak, deities started kind of getting together. There are different groups throughout the United States, throughout the UK, and all of these people got together and they started sharing information. And as they shared this information from one family grimoire got put into another's, and it started going down generation to generation, and it was working. And so it kept being passed on and propagated. And that's kind of what you have today. There's not a lot of demonolatry families out there. I mean, as far as like generational.
Yeah.
But a lot of the stuff that we have, like the Ducante stuff, that was him personally. He did not create demonolatry. He just went to all of these families that he knew and pulled that information together into his own work.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it was almost like a spiritualist direct channeling and kind of comparing notes and putting that together in a personal kind of grimoire experience. Were there were there a lot of overlaps in these pieces?
Well, there were. I mean, there was some new information, and there's still new information being added all of the time. If I don't have an enn or a sigil for a specific demon, I'll go out into my network and say, hey, does anyone have this? And we do that all the time. And then someone will give you, one, and they're like, oh, but I have another one. And it's not standardized at that time, but you put it in, like I said, you publish it for other people. They work with it. And if it works, they continue using it and it continues to propagate. The stuff that doesn't work doesn't propagate as much. It's kind of like, the cream rises to the top.
So in your opinion, what is the key then to contact really? Is it the enn? Is it the sigil? Is it the intent? Is it the state of development of the witch? The belief? What exactly is that magic source, that formula?
Well, I think what it is first of all, intent. That is like the biggest ingredient to any type of magic, right? And I also think it has a great deal to do with how the magician perceives things. But at the same time, the sigil and the enn, so the enn changes the energy of the space to draw in that essence, but the sigil, I think, inspires. And a lot of people don't look at the inspiration side of magic. Magic is all about creation. So there's a great deal of inspiration there. All magicians are creators in their own right. Just like, artists of any ilk, whether it be music, visual art, or the written word. So I really do. I think it's a combination of factors. It starts with the magician. It has to start with the magician.
You touched on something there in the very opening of that just, it was like, to me, that statement was the price of admission. And when you said that it's the perception of the magician being so key. And I grew up old spiritualist, and the idea was always that we are God, individuals, and that we create reality. So if you have a paradigm or a model of reality where these things are probable, and that rule set is really the big determining factor, and it's a personal one. You can adopt something from somebody's system, but only once it becomes part of your heart, so to speak, is the moment that it actually works, which again is the old matching for the Hebrew Shekhinah on the front of the tree of life, which translates as understanding. So my question in that for you is, you are an incredibly creative individual. You're an artist, a sorcerer artist, so to speak. You've written in countless different genres and styles and methods in your ability to produce worlds, so to speak, in the internal as well as in the external. Language being your primary modality for bringing about those things. And I think that in itself is the principle of true spellcraft. The grimoire of grammar and the use of language. What to you is the relationship between that language and the inner landscape and the role it plays in one's personal magic?
I do believe, well, I mean, that can kind of branch out into a lot of different areas.
Yeah.
For people who are, say, very visually aesthetic, they might do better working magic in a very visually aesthetic atmosphere. So they may have a temple that is decorated in such a way that it inspires them, that it draws their confidence, it draws their personal strength. They just draw so much just from their surroundings. With the written word, a lot, and that can be painful at times. I mean, I'm not an eloquent person. I'm not one of those people who speaks in like purple prose and large metaphors. So I feel like a complete moron sometimes when I'm trying to come up with just like, some sort of like liturgical rite where I have to say something grand about these demonic forces, because you have to like literally reach into yourself and pull it out and then find the right exact words for that to evoke that feeling from within that draws the strength. And that's why I think a lot of the spell books with a lot of the really pretty poetry about certain demonic forces or whatever really resonates with people, because especially if they do enjoy the written word and they connect with that, because they can read it and it can help them draw or evoke that feeling from within themselves, that strength or confidence or whatever they need to add to their magic. So I think creativity in that sense, for me at least, I mean, as far as like the written words, it's the sound, it's the vibration for me, but it also triggers that deep emotional response. And I think you almost need that, not just a psychological response, not just a physical response, but you need an emotional response, because that goes towards solidifying the intent.
I always believe that the ceremonial component of magic to me is the beautification. It's the seduction of your own soul by whatever modality in art is the most powerful, and through the process of meaning, elevating that art into such a state where it's able to alter your own consciousness in order to produce ground for these beings or these kind of probabilities of consciousness in ourselves to then almost open up the playing ground for that which is beyond it. Now, I think when somebody kind of because one can very easily get caught up purely in the psychological in terms of this. How does one police themselves? Do you police them yourself? Is there a place where the mind stops and the supernatural begins, or is it such an overlap? Can you explore that for us?
So this goes back to the discernment, but a lot of people, like, I always find it interesting how some people's spirits agree with them, they hate the same people, dislike the same things. That's yourself speaking. I mean, there is a way to kind of tell and to kind of judge. First of all, generally speaking, demonic forces don't pick sides in earthly battles. They don't. They're parts of they're natural forms of the universe. The universe can be both cruel and kind. It's not going to say, "Oh yeah, I hate Jane too," because she was mean to you or whatever. That's not how that generally works. So when you hear
bestie.
right, exactly. So I I found there is an overlap, so it is really difficult to discern when you're dealing with your higher self or just your own mind
Mm.
versus dealing with um, the actual essence
Yeah.
of that energy that you're working with, that's somehow sentient in its own way energy.
Mm.
And the difference is that it's not always going to tell you what you want to hear, and sometimes it's going to share some really brutal truths with you about yourself and things that need to happen in order for you to get what you want. Because there's a lot of self work, like, especially if you're doing the big magic, a lot of people are like, oh, I can just do low magic and get everything I want. Well, you can get windfalls, you can get, a
Mm.
check you didn't expect, whatever. But it's going to be fleeting, and you're going to find yourself in the same position again,
Mm.
over and over again, if you just do nothing but use low magic. When you do the high magic, you can create lasting results. And you do that by working on yourself and facing those really hard truths about yourself and about your decision making or whatever it is that is holding you back from your full potential to actually reach and manifest that goal, whatever it may be. So,
So this kind of makes me curious about, if we talk about the notion of blood sacrifice inside of magic, is that also, where's the power really in that? Is it in the actual blood, or is it in the symbolism and psychological meaning of self-sacrifice, which is almost more important inside of the work, that you're willing to make that payment, that cost and that change? Where is that?
it is in the psychological and symbolic
Okay.
act of bloodletting, because demonolatry is a bloodletting tradition.
Hmm.
We routinely use diabetic lancet devices to
Yes.
prick a finger and put a drop of blood onto a magical item or onto a request when we're working with the demonic force or whatever it is. And the reason that we do that, and we don't sacrifice animals, okay? We don't sacrifice people. That's a huge misconception.
That's more of a mental
One drop,
illness, really, than.
right? Yeah, and we can actually go back into that more here in a minute. But when you are pricking your finger and adding a drop of blood, first of all, the symbology of that, the blood is your life force. Without it, you die.
Mm.
So basically, it's one of the most sacred things to you. And you're adding that to your magic, saying, I am willing to shed my blood for this. So there's that psychological component. I want this bad enough that I'm willing to bleed for it. And you're not, you don't want to hurt yourself. We're completely against self-harm.
Yeah.
But if it's just a finger prick and it's just one single drop of blood, that's what it is.
It's not like the Hollywood depiction of gushing streams of blood and, virgins being
Right.
sacrificed, or all that superficial material that clearly is symbolic in extreme level, but it's not what is required. It's that personal meaning, that personal relationship that you're kind of communicating.
Well, and it's like the blood, symbolically and psychologically, is the physical bond between you and your magic. And one thing a lot of people don't realize is even Franz Barden, when he was talking about creating fluid condensers, tells the magician to add a drop of their blood to their fluid condenser to attune it to them.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I think I believe that's actually in initiation into hermetics. I think it's in there. I actually have that screenshotted somewhere, but a lot of people don't realize that, because there are a lot of ceremonial magicians against the actual using a drop of blood in magic. Some think that if you're feeding blood to demons and they're going to destroy you, and just request more and more and more until you destroy yourself.
Which is,
and that's not it. Yeah, I'm here to tell you, I've been practicing blood magic probably from age 14 until now. So, 35 years at least for the blood magic. I'm still here. I'm not suicidal.
you're still
I'm not
healthy,
depressed.
doing well. No,
Right.
no monsters or pit of hell suddenly opened up.
Yeah, exactly. So really it is. It's like a psychological, physical bond that bonds you to the magic or to the item that symbolizes your magic, whatever it is. And the demons are there just to kind of hold you accountable to yourself.
Interesting. I like that kind of frame coming back again, as you've emphasized that it's a divine intelligence. It's not a, some secret thing underneath the table trying to make some deal with your soul, as, the boogeyman selling thing that's used to kind of keep control over children and people from all groups. It is, in fact, something that's going to require you to take personal responsibility, personal changes. You highlighted you can use shortcuts of low magic, but you're just going to be in the same position. That old phrase, you can give a man with a terrible psychology the lotto and he'll be broke within a year again. It's that same kind of a thing. And that's a pattern of addiction that's indicative of an unhealthy mind. This is a more of a it's advanced self-help.
Yes.
At a very kind of deep level. Now we're kind of starting to run out of time for this episode, and I think for everybody listening, this has been such a juicy one, and there's so many subjects that we can open up to. So if you're listening and you have any specific questions that you'd like us to raise, or maybe questions specifically to Stephanie, please add it to the comments, drop us a mail, and I'll make sure that those, and maybe, Stephanie, I can get you back here again for a future episode. This already has been such an interesting discussion.
Yes.
Oh, perfect. I want to kind of close up our chat today with something that you've spoken about as well, is this, and the idea around curses and hexes. And the thing that I want to kind of frame or discuss around that is a little bit about the ethics in terms of, how that should be approached. But also, some people tend to approach it maybe because there's a justified situation for utilizing it. But in many cases, I find that it sometimes seems that there's underlining issues. And I think it's sometimes with those underlining issues that the magic even fails, because they're missing a lot of stuff that you've actually highlighted here. Taking personal responsibility, dealing with the transformation in yourself. What's your thoughts? What's your views on that? Because again, a lot of the newcomers or people on the outside of this path, think that's what we do. We're always cursing people and sacrificing people, and which is obvious by this chat, completely false. Can you share your thoughts on that as we bring this piece to a close?
So cursing can be used for a lot of reasons. It can be used to help destroy a bad situation. It can help you let go of a bad situation. It can help you just get rid of your anger and your hurt feelings. A lot of times when people say, a curse has come back on you by 3, it's not really coming back on you by 3. You're bringing it back on yourself by feeling guilty for doing it. So one of the things I always tell people when they decide to do a curse, first of all, let it sit for 3 days and then see how you feel after 3 days. And a lot of people say, well, just jump right in and do it. But you don't want to do that, because if the person that you curse actually dies or something bad happens, you're going to feel horrible about it. And then you're going to bring that back on yourself. But when it comes to like really bad situations, like someone has like destroyed your life, killed your dog, something like that, I think cursing can actually be a healthy thing, because it helps you get out all of that anger and all of that frustration and all of those really intense, horrible feelings that you have toward another person or a situation itself, and helps you kind of let it go and work past it.
Instead
so cursing is
holding
really
it up and becoming ill as a result of keeping it in your body.
Yes, exactly. So I think it can be very healthy, but at the same time, I think we need to be very careful about how we utilize the curse. And I think oftentimes in our culture, especially, people run around cursing everybody at the slightest thing. It's like, oh, you did this thing and I didn't like it, I'm going to curse you. And then everybody jumps on the bandwagon because they all want to curse somebody too. And it's ridiculous, because a lot of times if you don't properly employ a curse, or you don't know what you're doing or whatever, you just end up, nobody wins in that situation. It just becomes a curse war where people are lobbing magic back and forth at each other. And oftentimes I do believe that if the natural universe, if the demonic divine does not see that a curse is warranted, they're not going to take part in it at all. They're not going to lend their energy to that.
I think you just touched on something very useful there, because people seem to like have this attitude of, oh, I can just call a goethic spirit or a demon or something like that and give it a little bit of a drop of blood and it's going to sort out my enemy. My experience has even been where I almost felt like when I was doing the course as if I was being contained, and that it was just a containment vessel for me to release and deal with the emotion and process, for me to come to a higher place where they actually stopped it from working, because by making it work, it would have been more harmful for me than actually going through the process, and just instead helped me to gain through personal growth. So this is an interesting thing, that certain demonic forces can actually be on your side in the big picture. Is it also true that some of them won't care and will simply support whatever you're doing? Some people will say that about, for example, Santa Morta, that, you know, she'll just do whatever you're kind of like creating. What's your view in that?
I don't believe so. I think a lot of times when we just throw curses, I think, because I view Santa Muerta as for example, she's just another type of demonic force. She's another type of divine intelligence. All of the gods of human creation or not are divine intelligence to some degree. There's a reason that, you know, people have been working with them for so long. I don't believe that, only because I have been cursed by someone who worked with Santa Muerta, and it didn't work. It had actually the opposite effect, where I was having all of these great successes. And I've had that before, where people will curse me and like my life just like gets amazingly good. And I'm like, wow, things are going great. And I think sometimes it'll backfire like that, because the demonic is trying to tell you, look, this is petty. And now you get to watch this person have all this success and seethe in your jealousy so that you can get over it. You need to get over it and move on with your own life. Concentrate on you and quit concentrating on this person over here who has a totally different life and different circumstances than you. Basically, they're like saying none of your business.
That's actually quite brilliant, because that also kind of emphasizes the way that the demonic can teach us. The demonic doesn't necessarily teach us with the, you know, spoon of sugar. It sometimes says, you know, here's the salt on the wound that you're unwilling to pay attention to kind of force you to open your eyes and deal with that in order to come through to that process. Stephanie,
absolutely.
This has been an absolute delight. It's been so great chatting with you and just hearing your ideas and your story and your journey. I want to just thank you from the bottom of my heart for, you know, the wisdom that you've shared, as well as the continued contribution, you know, to sharing knowledge and information and getting that out there and helping practitioners and seekers kind of get out of those false perceptions and get to the roots and the core ideas, you know, behind this path. So I just want to thank you, you know, from the bottom of my heart, and just show a complete love and respect to you from myself and from the entire Cult of You community. Thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect. I look forward to a future chat with you. Is there maybe any kind of closing message or thought that you would like to leave, you know, those listening to as they kind of venture on this path, you know, before we close up and say goodbye?
Well, one thing I would like to say is just, you know, take your time with it. There's no rush to, you know, master everything in a day. Take your time, go through it, like really get a sense of the divine forces that you're working with. And, you know, I suppose that's it. Yeah.
Perfect.
Take your time.
Stephanie, thank you so very much. And I hope to see you again on the show. All
right. Thank you.
I've always felt a little different, a little uneasy between regular folk, a bit of a dreamer, a lost cause, a little non-ordinary, some would say. I think I've always just been this way. My mother said I was special. My father thought I should be feared. But I knew that witchcraft coursed through my veins the first time I tasted the lips of the goddess inside the rain. Yes, I'm a witch, it's true. And sure, we are the ones who believe in the beauty of nature, who believe in the things science absent of art cannot explain, who instead of religion would have romance. And sure, you may think we have lost our way, when in the world of predictable things we have such unfamiliar things that we would like to say. But maybe, in a world so cold and alone, a little unfamiliar is exactly what is needed to show us the way home. I've always felt a little different, a little uneasy between regular folk, a bit of a dreamer, a lost cause, a little non-ordinary, some would say. I think I've always just been this way. My mother said I was special, my father thought I should be feared. But I knew that witchcraft coursed through my veins the first time I tasted the lips of the goddess inside the rain. Yes, I'm a witch, it's true. And sure, we are the ones who believe in the beauty of nature, who believe in the things science, absent of art, cannot explain, who instead of religion would have romance. And sure, you may think we have lost our way, when in the world of predictable things we have such unfamiliar things that we would like to say. But maybe, in a world so cold and alone, a little unfamiliar is exactly what is needed to show us the way home.